Welcome to tonight's virtual Civil War presentation brought to you by CivilWarTalk.com. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's guest is Steve Norder discussing his book, Lincoln Takes Command, The Campaign to Seize Norfolk and the Destruction of the CSS Virginia, published by Savas Beatty in January of this year. Our series is provided by CivilWarTalk.com, the American Civil War discussion forum. We're pleased to be able to bring these fantastic Civil War authors and programs to you via the live virtual platform. If you aren't already a member of CivilWarTalk.com, we'll be providing membership information later in the program, and membership is always free, so I hope everyone will join the Civil War Talk community.
Our guest tonight, Steve Norder, has worked as a genealogist, teacher, author, newspaper reporter, and book editor. He has a strong interest in researching and writing about the tragic Civil War years, and his work has appeared in many places, including the Civil War Times Illustrated. Steve is originally from Iowa, but currently resides in Georgia, where he is a member of the Civil War Roundtable of Atlanta. In early May 1862, President Abraham Lincoln and two of his cabinet secretaries boarded a Treasury Department ship for Fort Monroe in Hampton Roads, Virginia. This trip resulted in the first and only time in our country's history that a sitting president took direct control of military forces, both Army and Navy, to wage a campaign with wide-ranging consequences. This little-known slice of the war and its effect on the president is the subject of the presentation tonight. Mr. Norder will be discussing his book, Lincoln Takes Command, The Campaign to Seize Norfolk and the Destruction of the CSS Virginia, published by Savas Beatty in January of this year. Despite untold numbers of books penned about Abraham Lincoln, his presidency, his struggles during the Civil War, this one fascinating week described in Lincoln Takes Command has never been told in such full detail. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Steve Norder.
Is that my cue? Okay. Thank you very much for all who are tuned in for this. I hope everyone's been staying safe from during this year. It's been one crazy year. What I'd like to do is just start out and by saying a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on Abraham Lincoln. As you know, there are many others who have studied Lincoln's life and from beginning to end. I'll switch over to the share the screen. And come on. There we go. Abraham Lincoln has been analyzed, criticized, mythologized, even satirized. How many have seen the 2012 movie about Lincoln hacking at vampires? But I want to examine Abraham Lincoln in the context of 1 week during his presidency. It was an important week, May 5 to 12, 1862. It was a week that Lincoln escaped from Washington to sail down to Hampton Roads, Virginia. And during that week, he set military goals and as commander-in-chief took direct control of the military forces, both the Army and Navy, to accomplish those goals. For the first and only time in our history, the president not only carried the title of commander-in-chief, but actually acted as a military commander. George Washington did not do that during the Whiskey Rebellion. James Madison also had prior military experience in the Revolutionary War and could have commanded the U.S. military during the August 24, 1814 Battle of Blandenburg, Maryland, but that president left the command to his general. So here's President Lincoln, acting as commander-in-chief, but having the most minimal of practical experience in military matters. During the short Black Hawk War of 1832, as a volunteer elected captain, Lincoln never saw action. In fact, he admitted some years later that his battle was not with Native Americans, but he had a good many struggles with mosquitoes. To my mind, the spectacular aspect of Lincoln's Hampton Roads campaign was not that he took an active role as a military commander, but that he accomplished his goals without any loss of life. What he did and how he did it are in my book, but it is his personal approach and interactions with those around him that interest me. Abraham Lincoln is the most written about person and the most written about period in American history. But scholars still are learning more about him. There are hundreds of letters, notes, and speeches that Lincoln wrote during his life. So you'd think that there is not much more that can be said about him. But we do not know about him day to day. What did he say to those he was with? How did he act? How did he feel about what he was doing? Unlike modern presidents, there was no one writing down every word that Lincoln said. There were no video cameras recording him walking from the executive mansion to the War Department, which he often did during the war. No reporters waiting outside for an impromptu news conference on the lawn. And of course, Lincoln did not send out any daily tweets. We only get glimpses of his day-to-day activities and what he said from those who bothered to write them down, sometimes years later. Therefore, this is a glimpse of Lincoln during that 1 week in 1862. It is the impression he left on others during that week. Oops, wrong direction. We first meet Lincoln on a rainy Monday evening, May 5, 1862. It is dark. A man in a rain slicker is standing outside the entrance gate to the Washington Navy Yard. He is waiting. He is a brigadier general in a city full of officers and soldiers. His name is Egbert L. Veely. Soon a carriage arrives, stops, and out steps the large figure of Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War. The two men meet, then turn to walk into the Navy Yard. They ascend the gangplank of the U.S. Treasury ship Miami and head directly to the main cabin. Upon entering, the two now wet men are greeted by Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, and President Abraham Lincoln. Then Veely, to his surprise, is told that he will make a trip down the Potomac River and on to Fort Monroe at Hampton Roads with three of the most powerful men in the country. The trip's purpose, according to Lincoln's private secretaries, was to ascertain by personal observation whether some further vigilance and vigor might not be infused into the operations of the Army at that point. Now, briefly, this was during Major George B. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, an effort to get to Richmond, Virginia by the side door up the peninsula rather than directly south from Washington. However, McClellan, as his usual habit, became too cautious and had been stuck before Yorktown long enough for the main Confederate Army to shift toward a blocking position. So Lincoln was taken to Miami from Washington, down the Potomac River, down to Fort Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. And the peninsula is formed by the York River on the north side and the James River on the south side. And Lincoln had two goals in making his trip. First, he hoped he could spur McClellan and his army on toward Richmond. However, the Confederates had abandoned Yorktown the day before, and as it turned out, McClellan did not want to meet with the president anyway. Second, Lincoln had an idea that something could be done in Hampton Roads area to take the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, as well as the Gosport Navy Yard. Norfolk is off of Hampton Roads, up the Elizabeth River. Across the river is Portsmouth, and next to Portsmouth is the Gosport Navy Yard. The result, Lincoln hoped, would be the end of the Southern ironclad ship, the CSS Virginia. Now, ever since the Virginia's appearance 2 months earlier, resulting in the sinking of the USS Cumberland and the burning of the USS Congress, the US Navy's North Atlantic blockading squadron at Fort Monroe had been paralyzed. While the northern ship, the USS Monitor's timely appearance thwarted any further destruction by the Virginia, the Navy's focus was on the feared monster, but nothing was being done to remove that monstrous threat. Hold on, there we go. Thus, the three civilian leaders and the lone brigadier general settled into their cozy stateroom to discuss what could be done to move forward. First, they talked about the overall military situation, which lasted long into the night, Dooley said. They studied maps, reread commanders' reports, and gave opinions on what was to happen. Many other topics, relevant and irrelevant, were discussed, Dooley wrote later, interspersed with the usual number of anecdotes from the never-failing supply with which the president's mind was stored. Now, I'm going to read Dooley's description of Lincoln, as I think it is one of the best given of him. The general said, the evening was an interesting study of the country's leaders, relieved for the moment from the surroundings of their onerous official duties. And Lincoln, of course, was the center of the group, Dooley said. Kind, genial, thoughtful, tender-hearted, magnanimous Abraham Lincoln. It was difficult to know him without knowing him intimately, for he was as guileless and single-hearted as a child. And no man ever knew him intimately who did not recognize and admire his great abilities, both natural and acquired, his large-heartedness and sincerity of purpose. His inexhaustible stock of anecdotes gave to superficial minds the impression that he was not a thoughtful and reflecting man, whereas the fact was directly the reverse. These anecdotes form no more a part of Mr. Lincoln's mind than the smile forms a part of the face. They came unbidden, and like the forced smile, were often employed to conceal a depth of anxiety in his own heart and to dissipate the care that weighed upon the minds of his associates. Now, Lincoln's penchant for telling stories is well known, but those stories had a purpose, though he admitted the stories were usually secondhand. I remember a good story when I hear it, Lincoln is quoted as saying, but I never invented anything original. I'm only a retail dealer. His friend and protector, Ward Hill Layman, described the president's humor as a plaster that heals many a wound. A Lincoln story could be used to cheer the drooping spirits of a friend, lighten the weight of his own melancholy, a pinch, as it were, of mental snuff, Layman said, clinch an argument, expose a fallacy, or disarm an antagonist. Mostly, though, Lincoln employed a story as a labor-saving contrivance. Eventually, the group on board the Miami came to the conclusion that Norfolk could be taken. The conference ended, and they went to bed. The next morning, with the ship now under sail, continuing down the Potomac River, Lincoln and others sat out on the quarterdeck. The president entertained us with numerous anecdotes and incidences of his life, of the most interesting character, Dooley said. One of those stories concerned Lincoln's reputation as a young man, splitting logs into fence rails. While we were sitting on deck, Lincoln saw an axe in a socket on the bulwarks, according to Dooley, and taking it up, held it at arm's length at the extremity of the helm and forefinger, continuing to hold it there for a number of minutes. Now, obviously, this is not a hatchet or an axe, but holding it at the helm is just at the end of the handle with a thumb and forefinger and holding straight out. Now, I've tried this with a hatchet, and I can't hold it there for even a second. Just to think that Lincoln could hold it there and just keep, his hands must have been very strong. The most powerful sailors on board tried in vain to imitate him. Mr. Lincoln said he could do this when he was 18 years of age and had never seen a day since that time when he could not. Now, the president not only could tell a funny story, but he enjoyed the humor from others. As he read a recent Harper's Weekly, Lincoln came across a humorous poem by an unknown author. According to Dooley, Lincoln liked the poem so much that he wanted to save it. Instead of requesting me to cut it out for him, Dooley said, he borrowed my knife and, extending himself at half length on the deck, spread the paper before him and cut the piece out. Now, picture this. Here's Lincoln down on his knees, leaning over a paper that's spread on the deck. And he says, "It's not precisely the attitude for the President of the United States to assume, but it was a good position for a man who merely wanted to cut a piece out of a paper." Now, this poem, which really, unfortunately, does not say what it is, amused Lincoln so much that the president had to read it out loud over and over again. He even called for the Miami's captain to come down to hear it. It was a very absurd idea, absurdly expressed, but there was something about it that pleased Lincoln's fancy, according to Dooley. The president appeared to enjoy it the more oftener he read it. Now, how many have seen the 2012 movie Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, playing the president and directed by Steven Spielberg? I think that movie has set the image for Lincoln for a whole generation, much like Walter Houston's portrayal of Lincoln in the 1930 film Abraham Lincoln did for an earlier generation. Now, there is one scene in Spielberg's version that struck me as spot on. This scene, and this is a still from that scene, it's set in January 1865 in the War Office telegraph room, where the president could be found frequently as he tried to satisfy his desire for information about his armies. With Lincoln is Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, played very well in the movie by the actor Bruce McGill. The leaders, along with a good many others in the room, are awaiting to hear if Fort Fisher had been taken. That is the key to closing Wilmington, North Carolina, and the South's then last available port for blockade runners. Everyone was tense. Lincoln says that waiting on the unknown reminded him of a story. And at that point in the movie, Stanton throws up some papers in the air and says, "No, you're going to tell a story. I don't believe I can bear to listen to another of your stories right now." An exasperated Stanton storms out of the room, yelling for some report he had to read just then. Now, of course, Lincoln being Lincoln, he just goes on to tell the story to everyone else. Now, picture this true story from 1862. On board the Miami as it glides down the Potomac. Those on board spot a mile-long row of barges, each laden with stones. Seeing these barges, according to Dooley, Lincoln says, "Oh, that is Stanton's Navy. That is the squadron that the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, would have nothing to do with and about which he and Stanton had the dispute." It was finally decided, Lincoln believed, that the War Department might have a fleet of its own to fight the Merrimack. And there it is. We were all scared at that time. Mr. Welles felt bad enough, but was not enough scared to listen to Stanton's scheme of blockading the river. Said the fleet of boats would be useless, and if used, worse than useless. Veely described Stanton's reaction to Lincoln's levity as being disconcerted. The secretary said it was best to prepare for the emergency if the Virginia did attempt to come up the Potomac River to Washington. Your emergency, Lincoln reportedly replied, reminds me of a circumstance which took place in Illinois. The president's story concerned a fellow lawyer, unnamed, on the Illinois Judicial Circuit. This man, according to Lincoln, was noted for a remarkable development of his breasts, the glands being enormous. The man argued that Providence provided him with that development for a reason, and according to Lincoln, went on to say, if he ever had been stranded on an island along with a young infant, he would be able to feed the child. This, he said, according to the president, with as much apparent sincerity as Stanton showed when he urged a navy composed of canal boats to stop the Merrimac. In both situations, there would be as much requirement as soon as Stanton's fleet to fight and keep back an iron frigate, the preparation for an anticipated emergency, which is about as likely to occur in one case as the other, is very striking. Now, Veely did not record Stanton's reaction to Lincoln's story, unlike in that movie. But given what we know of Stanton's personality, he probably did not laugh at it. This is a bird's eye view of Hampton Roads. Now, normally we see maps looking south to north. This is looking from north to south with Fort Monroe at the bottom, Hampton Roads. This is the Elizabeth River, and up the Elizabeth River is Norfolk. Across the river is Portsmouth. And then to the far right is the entrance to the James River. Now, the Miami sailed out of the Potomac River and into the more turbulent waters of the Chesapeake Bay, and then south to Fort Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. And the party arrived in the evening. There. Brigadier General John E. Wool was the Army commander in charge of the district around the fort and the northern part of Hampton Roads. The southern part was held by the Confederacy. The blockading squadron's Navy commander was Flag Officer Lewis M. Goldsborough. Just to show how serious Lincoln was in accomplishing something upon Wool boarding the Miami to greet the visitors, the president asked Wool about attacking Norfolk across the roads. The general replied he could not do so without the help of the Navy, and therefore Lincoln decided right then to go visit Goldsborough on his command ship, the USS Minnesota. Despite the late hour and the darkness, according to Secretary Chase in a letter the next day, it was determined that the president, Mr. Stanton, General Wool, Chase, and General Veely should visit Goldsborough and talk with him about the condition of this and the things to be done. They took a tugboat out to the Minnesota, where a plan was put together for the Navy to attack some of the Confederate defenses guarding the entrance to the Elizabeth River, and then have the Army cross the roads to invade. Well, even Lincoln could not get Wool to organize his soldiers overnight for an invasion. Therefore, the president had to be patient the next day. And probably to satisfy the president's eagerness for activity, Stanton suggested the four of them sail out to the roads to one of the many ships that composed the blockading squadron. No. I'll get the hang of this before the end of this talk. They visited the Cornelius Vanderbilt. This was the largest ship and the namesake of the richest man in the country. When the tour was over, it was time to officially land at Fort Monroe and have breakfast with General Wool and his staff. Later, Lincoln and the others toured the fort, as well as taking a steamer out to the smaller Fort Wool, named after the general. During these tours, the president once again showed his mechanical bent. He witnessed the rifling of a gun tube and the firing of the Lincoln gun, which was sat outside Fort Monroe, and the Sawyer gun, which was at Fort Wool. He then sailed to visit the Monitor. Dang. This was the ship that saved the fleet at Hampton Roads from a rampage in Virginia 2 months earlier. This was the ship that, without Lincoln's endorsement the previous September, might not have been built. Upon reaching the iron ship, most of the dignitaries, like other visitors, were filled with the enthusiasm and patriotism, ready, like a bottle of soda water, to effervesce the instant the cork is withdrawn, according to William F. Keeler, the ship's paymaster. But that was not Lincoln. As the boat which brought the party came alongside, every eye sought the Monitor but his own, Keeler wrote that day. He stood with his face averted, as if to hide some disagreeable sight. When he turned to us, I could see his lip quiver and his frame tremble with strong emotion, and I imagined that the terrible drama in these waters in March was passing in review before him. Keeler said the president was most interested in the Monitor's mechanics. While he only saw a model those many months earlier, stating then, "All I have to say is what the girl said when she stuck her foot into the stocking. It strikes me there's something in it." Lincoln was on the real ship now, a ship that had proven its worth and his favorable decision. He examined everything about the vessel with care, manifesting great interest, Keeler wrote. His remarks evidently showing that he had carefully studied what he thought to be our weak points, and that he was well acquainted with all the mechanical details of our construction. Keeler is standing in the back row, third from left, wearing the glasses. Keeler concluded that Lincoln's few remarks as he accompanied us around the vessel were sound, simple, and practical. The points of admiration and exclamation he left in his suit, we would say suit pocket. For Lincoln's part, he was happy to find out that Keeler, who was a volunteer officer, was from his home state of Illinois. With the tour over, and following a second consultation with Goldsboro, Lincoln still had more time on his hands. General Wool suggested he escort his guests out to the soldiers' camps. Now, most of Wool's soldiers could not fit into Fort Monroe, but they had a camp on the main part of the peninsula at Camp Hamilton. And Wool was anxious for the president to come review his units. As Lincoln and the others waited for mounts to be prepared and a carriage for Stanton, who did not ride a horse, they sat in the fort's telegraph room at Wool's headquarters, which is labeled as headquarters number 1. A young telegrapher, John Emmett O'Brien, and his older brother, Richard, manned the telegraph station. John wrote in a post-war book that he walked into the room whistling Dixie, not noticing the strangers. "Richard chided me rather sharply for my levity," John said. "It was such an unprecedented thing for him to do that I was much confused and had only time to feel more surprised than hurt when a tall, lank, ungainly man rose up and told my brother that it was all right, that Dixie was his favorite tune." It was Abraham Lincoln. O'Brien continued to watch the group as they moved to the porch to get their horses. "The most striking figure of that group that I still see in my imagination is Mr. Lincoln," he later wrote. "There he stands, head and shoulders above the rest, his rugged features illumined by a gleam of humor, as the staff searches in vain for gauntlets large enough to fit the firm and honest hand that held the destinies of the nation." So without gloves, the president, upon a fine bay steed, according to O'Brien, Chase, Wool, and his staff, also on horseback, and Stanton in a carriage, left through the fort's east gate to see the soldiers and the countryside. Fort Monroe is right here. They crossed the bridge, Camp Hamilton. Then they crossed another bridge into the partially burned out village of Hampton. As they crossed, went through the camp, Wool left orders for the unit commanders to prepare for a dress review upon the group's return. From Hampton, there are some reports that they continued on the road all the way over to Newport News and Camp Butler, which also was Union held, that helped guard part of the entrance up the James River. If Lincoln did come over here, he would have had a chance to use binoculars to see the Virginia, the CSS Virginia, which at that point was off Craney Island. On their approach back to the military camp, the various regiments were lined up, ready for some to march in review and others to stand while Lincoln went by. At one point, the president and his party came upon the 1st Delaware Regiment of Volunteers. This regiment, under Colonel John W. Andrews, was known for its skill in drilling and marching. The colonel personally had bought brass shoulder scales and white gloves for his enlisted men and required the officers to have epaulets and regulation felt hats with plumes, according to William P. Seville, captain of Company K. It inspired each man with just pride in it that proved a most excellent esprit de corps, Seville said. Now, the regimental drum major was Patrick Dooley. He was decked out with the tallest and most gorgeous shako with trimming to match, Seville said. And I could not find a picture of Patrick Dooley. So Francis Saxey Pike from the 1st New Hampshire has volunteered to represent Dooley. But on this carte de visite, on the table, is Saxey's shako, his tall hat, often covered in bearskin, and usually having the tall plume. And Saxey is holding his drum major's baton. The regiment's dress parades were so admired that other regiments rescheduled their own parades in order to come watch the 1st Delaware perform. So here was the full 1st Delaware standing in order, waiting for the president to come by. There was Dooley with his band playing and marching along the regiment's front. And here comes Lincoln, accompanied by a very large escort, according to Seville, all mounted. Lincoln turns his horse to follow the band as it marches in front of the regiment, followed by the entire party. But when the band had reached the left of the line and had turned to right about to march back to its original position on the right, and Drum Major Dooley, with his glittering staff presented at an angle of 45 degrees from his manly breast, had advanced with the martial stride through the midst of the musicians to suddenly come face to face with the president. And all were brought to a dead halt. The situation was growing serious. There sat the president, looking somewhat embarrassed, according to Seville. And there stood Dooley, firm as the rock of Gibraltar, the equestrian brigade supporting the president, and the band resolutely backing up the drum major, marking time and playing away with their best energy. After a few moments of hesitation, which provoked a hearty peal of laughter from all, the president finally realized that he was in the enemy's country, where martial law was supreme, and that therefore the civil branch of the government should give way to the military. And doubtless recognizing the drum major's determinations to do his duty or die in his tracks, turned out of the way with all his followers and opened the road for Dooley and the band out of their dilemma. The next day, Lincoln watched as the Navy followed his plan. A 3-ship flotilla, including the ironclad Galena, sailed up the James River. The orders were to protect General McClellan's left flank along the peninsula, and if possible, go all the way up to Richmond to shell the Confederate capital. While the first task was eventually would be a success, the second would not happen. More immediately, at Hampton Roads, most of the remaining Navy warships set out for Sewell's Point, the fort, along with the one at Craney Island, guarding the entrance to the Elizabeth River. In a 4-hour bombardment, the Union ships pounded Sewell's Point. Lincoln hoped that the attack would clear the way for soldiers to land nearby. But that hope was dashed when the CSS Virginia sailed down from Norfolk. As planned, the Union ships backed off to lure the Virginia out into the Roads' deeper water. Once there, large ships, including the Vanderbilt, were to ram the ironclad. The Virginia's commander, Josiah Tatnall, did not let his ship go that far out to give those ramming ships a chance. And Lincoln was disappointed. With the Virginia lurking near Sewell's Point, it was dangerous to send soldiers towed in canal barges over for a landing. The president's campaign was stymied. So the following morning, Friday, May 9, the Virginia still was near Sewell's Point. But Lincoln wanted to know how well the Point's batteries were manned. Based on information provided the previous day by a deserting steam tugboat captain, the president knew the Confederate military was abandoning Norfolk and Portsmouth. And Lincoln was impatient, focusing on capturing Norfolk and the nearby naval yard and destroying the Virginia. And by nature, the president was not content doing nothing. After breakfast, he took a tugboat out to the USS Monitor. He wanted the iron ship's captain, Lieutenant William Jeffers, to sail over to Sewell's Point to determine if any Confederates were left. The commander-in-chief's order was couched as a request, which to me, it shows he was not yet comfortable giving direct orders. He also knew that Jeffers' superior, Lewis M. Goldsborough, was a stickler for the Navy tradition of command authority. His Excellency, the President, came alongside this morning and inquired whether there would be any military impropriety in my getting underway without your previous order, Jeffers later reported to Goldsborough. I replied to the President, it was necessary and proper that you should be informed in order that you might know that I had not acted without authority. Lincoln took the responsibility upon himself of letting Goldsborough know of the move, and the Monitor headed to Sewell's Point. Now, Paymaster Keeler on board the Monitor approved of Lincoln's actions. He wrote to his wife, "It is extremely fortunate that the president came down as he did. He seems to have infused new life into everything. Even the superannuated old fogies begin to show some signs of life and animation. He has been busy today visiting different points. Not a place has escaped him where he thought his presence could do any good." But eventually, the president returned to Fort Monroe to await Jeffers' report on the conditions across the roads. To kill some more time, Lincoln went up to Colonel LeGrand B. Cannon's office. Now, Cannon was General Wool's adjutant. He had given the president a copy of William Shakespeare's plays the evening before. And Lincoln was very familiar with the Bard's plays, having a particular interest in reading and rereading the tragedies and the histories. As Cannon worked, Lincoln found a comfortable spot near a window to read. After a couple hours, Lincoln called for Cannon to join him. "Come in here," Cannon quotes the president, and sit with me and rest. I will read you some passages from Shakespeare." Cannon said he was surprised how well Lincoln read various passages from Macbeth, King Lear, and King John. But as he said some lines from the King John play, Cannon noticed that his voice became tremulous and he seemed to be deeply moved. Now, for some of you who read the play a few years ago, or maybe got out of reading it altogether, the play, The Life and Death of King John, concerns the king contending with rebellious nobles and the pesky French, while trying to solidify his crown. In the play, Constance, John's sister-in-law, responds to the king's capture of her son and her belief that John will murder her son to remove any doubt to John's claim as king. Now, Cannon does not say what passage from the play Lincoln read, but a review of the play provides the following likely lines. "Grief fills the room of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then I have reason to be fond of grief. I will not keep this form upon my head when there's such disorder in my wit. O Lord, my boy, my Arthur, my fair son, my life, my joy, my food, my all the world, my widow comfort, and my sorrows cure." Cannon said that when Lincoln finished reading, he closed the book. Did you ever dream of some lost friend and feel that you were having a sweet communion with him, and yet have a consciousness that it was not a reality? The president asked Cannon. "Everyone has such dreams," the colonel replied. "That is the way I dream of my lost boy, Willie," Lincoln said, breaking down in most convulsive weeping. Cannon described the scene of Lincoln crying as the most grievous and distressing to see this great, strong man give way to such emotion. And I was so sympathetically moved that I too broke down utterly. He sat there with his head bowed on the table, and Cannon quietly left the room. Now, referring back to the Lincoln movie, you may recall how the president's wife, Mary, played by Sally Field, admonishes her husband for not being sufficiently distraught over the loss of their son Willie to typhoid in February 1862. That movie scene was set in early 1865, about 3 years after Willie's death. But here, Cannon described a very distraught president only 3 months after the loss of his son. Now, one thing that I admire about Lincoln is that he seems to have had the ability to compartmentalize his emotions. And Lincoln was more determined to find a solution to taking Norfolk. He sought out an engineer and a map. Now, it happened that while Lincoln was ordering the Monitor to test the Sewell's Point batteries and then reading Shakespeare, Salmon Chase and General John Wool had been scouting for possible landing sites along the Virginia coast. They found such a site, and Chase was anxious to tell the president, and Lincoln became excited about it and decided to go look for himself. So Lincoln, along with Chase and Stanton, took the Miami from Fort Monroe over to the Rip Raps, or Fort Wool, where they picked up a tugboat and some soldiers, and they sailed outside of Hampton Roads. Remember, the Virginia was over here at Seals Point, and they went outside of Hampton Roads down along the Virginia coast. Once the water became too shallow for the Treasury ship, Lincoln and Stanton transferred to the tugboat to get closer to shore. With the tug almost scraping bottom, the president and some soldiers put out in a rowboat. About 6 p.m., with the sun just beginning to set, the American president, somewhere along this beach, landed and walked up and down a considerable distance to assure himself that there could be no mistake in the matter. according to Chase. So here's the President of the United States landing and scouting an enemy beach. Chase described the scene as how little the Confederacy dreamed what a visitor it's had that night to the sacred soil. The news of Lincoln's daring spread quickly upon the party's return to Fort Monroe. Soldiers greeted him with enthusiastic cheering. The newspaper men at the fort praised Lincoln for taking an important and dangerous reconnaissance, adding, not only was the president a calm, dispassionate, honest statesman, but a naval and military commander of no mean pretensions. Lincoln's invasion plan was back in business. The rest of that evening and into the night, regiments along with cavalry and artillery under Wool's command were marched to the fort's wharves and boarded upon almost everything that floated. It was a beautiful sight to see them this evening as the long files marched down to the boats to embark, Keeler wrote to his wife. As you can see in this watercolor that was done by a soldier shortly after the invasion, the soldiers marching down to the various wharves and boarding the ships, followed by some cavalry, and also artillery was loaded. A New York Times reporter described the scene as highly picturesque. We stood upon the beach, the sea perfectly smooth and reflecting, the hundreds of lights that glanced fitfully along from the vessels gliding to and fro, as well as the moon and the stars. The night air was all alive with the songs and cheers of the embarking troops. In the midst of it all was Abraham Lincoln. A Philadelphia reporter said the president was the busiest and hardest working man on the wharf during the embarkation. And if you look at the bottom of the watercolor, there's a group, most of these are civilians, and one is taller than the others with a tall hat. And I suspect that is Lincoln. By midnight, most of the vessels were loaded and the invasion expedition set sail. Lincoln and the other leaders went back to Wool's headquarters to catch a few hours sleep before they too would head for the Virginia beach. The landing was unopposed early the next morning. While Lincoln watched from a tugboat, Chase went ashore to accompany the little army on its march to Norfolk. Lincoln and Stanton returned to Fort Monroe to wait on the results. It was going to be a long day, and General Wool failed to send updated reports back to the president. So as the hours ticked off, Lincoln became more and more anxious. At one point in the morning, artillery fire was clearly heard from the other side of the roads. They could see smoke in the far distance, but there's no explanation. A while later, Lincoln sent for General Joseph K.F. Mansfield and Colonel Joseph B. Carr. Mansfield had been part of the invasion army, but Wool had sent him back to bring over more soldiers. The anxious president asked Carr, "Where is your command?" "At Camp Hamilton, sir," Carr answered. "Why are you not on that side at Norfolk?" asked Lincoln. "I'm awaiting orders," came the reply. Lincoln then turned to Mansfield. "Why are you here?" the president demanded. "Why not on the other side?" The general said Wool ordered him to the fort. Now that brought a vehement response by Lincoln, according to Carr. Throwing his tall hat on the floor, the president began uttering strongly his disapproval and disappointment. He then dictated an order to General Wool to require the remaining troops at Camp Hamilton to head for Norfolk, and those already landed to be sped up to take the city. It's not known if Wool received Lincoln's order. The general already was well along on the road to Norfolk, where he would enter in the late afternoon. At Chase's suggestion, General Dooley was made military governor of Norfolk, Portsmouth, and soon Suffolk. With that, Wool and Chase, leaving the various regiments under Dooley's command behind, took a carriage back to the landing beach and then sailed across to Fort Monroe. Close to midnight, the two walked up from the fort's wharf to the headquarters building. Lincoln had been too keyed up to go to bed. He heard the two men approach, and leaning out the third floor window while in his nightshirt, the president shouted, "What is it?" "General Wool to present Norfolk to you," came the reply. Lincoln said to send Wool up to his room and wake up Stanton, who, while also wearing the nightshirt, jumped out of bed to storm into Lincoln's bedroom. Wool already was there, telling Lincoln, "Mr. President, Norfolk is ours." And Stanton burst in. President Lincoln was sitting on the edge of the bed, recalled Colonel Cannon. General Wool was there in full uniform and all covered with dust. Secretary Stanton rushed impetuously into General Wool's arms in his excitement and embraced him fervently. The president broke out laughing at seeing a general in uniform hugging his Secretary of War dressed in a nightshirt. "Look out, Mars," referring to Stanton. "If you don't, the general will throw you." So with her home port now in enemy hands, Josiah Tatnall had only one option to save the CSS Virginia, and that was to take her up the James River. However, the effort to lighten the ironclad ship enough to sail up the shallower river proved too much. That left Tatnall with no options. So he ordered the crew to abandon the ship for a long march to Richmond and had the ship set on fire. She blew up close to 5 a.m. the next morning. With the Virginia gone and the cities in Union control, Lincoln wanted to see the results of his campaign. So on the steamship Baltimore, the Union leaders sailed across Hampton Roads and up the Elizabeth River to Norfolk on Sunday, May 11. While at breakfast on the ship, Lincoln again saw the humor in Stanton's late night embrace of General Wool. Lincoln said, "You know, we all have been solicited by our artists to fill the panels of the Capitol with pictures illustrative of this war. I don't think anything has been done on our side until the capture of Norfolk worthy of illustration." So Lincoln proposed the Capitol should include a painting of Edwin Stanton jumping into the arms of General John Wool. Cannon later wrote that the joke was keenly appreciated, but he didn't specifically note Stanton's reaction. There it goes. Once at Norfolk, Lincoln did not leave the ship. There are some reports that he did. He did not. He could see the city. The U.S. flag was flying over the Custom House, which was Veely's headquarters, and it is still in Norfolk. You can visit it. He saw citizens milling around on the city wharves, as it shown in this Harper's Weekly illustration. Across the river is Portsmouth, which was obviously occupied, and next to Portsmouth was for Lincoln was the smoking ruins of the Gosport Navy Yard, which the Confederates set afire before they left. In this illustration, it's on fire. Lincoln had seen all he needed to see. He asked the Baltimore's captain to turn around and sail back to Washington. Lincoln had been gone from the capital long enough. Once back, the president was greeted as a military hero. A reporter for the New York Times said Lincoln has given his personal attention and care to every department of operations and has brought a very excellent and safe judgment to bear upon matters which required something more than mere professional knowledge and skill for their solution. And I do no justice to others in saying that much of the vigor and success of the recent operation here is due to the stimulus of his presence. Another newspaper reporter wrote, "The president is entitled to all the honors of a successful campaign and to the bestowment of the formal title of full general as the result of his visit to Fortress Monroe. A week's operations under his own eye was enough to destroy the Merrimac, the terror of the nation, and reduce Norfolk and its surrounding fortifications to the just authority of the United States. The general wish here is that he had gone to the headquarters of his army in front of Richmond, for it is believed that the power of his presence would have driven Jeff Davis headlong from his capital and made the way smooth for our victorious forces. Now, I like Abraham Lincoln because of these glimpses. He comes across to me as a kind, open person. And Lincoln's endearing quality to me is his sense of humor. Doris Kearns Goodwin put it best in a National Public Radio article from 2012. She quoted Lincoln, who was accused of being two-faced because he was not afraid to change his views on important topics. "If I had two faces," the president said, "do you think I'd be wearing this face?" Goodwin presents Lincoln's ability to laugh at himself as a certain kind of confidence. It means, she said, taking the world seriously, but not taking yourself so seriously at every moment. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for listening. Laura?
Thank you so much, Mr. Norder. That was fantastic. I know everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. We are going to get to the questions in just a moment, but first I would like to introduce Mike Kendra, who is the owner of CivilWarTalk.com, the American Civil War Discussion Forum. And we'll get to those questions after Mike, if that's all right with you, Mr. Norder. Mike?
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much, Mr. Norder. That was great. And I appreciate you providing that presentation tonight. It was great. I'm Mike Kendra. I'm the owner of CivilWarTalk. And tonight we're hosting Mr. Norder, and he's our guest presenter on Zoom. And this was a great opportunity to learn about another piece of American history. And if you're an author of a great Civil War book or a battlefield guide or a researcher or collector, and you have a story to tell, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you about providing a presentation like the one we did tonight. If you prefer not to do one of these Zoom presentations, we can work with you on a book launch or schedule a book launch like on our forum, or do some other type of promotional material on our website. Just talk to myself or maybe to Laura, and we can go ahead and arrange something. We love our weekly Civil War Talk Present programs, and there's lots more on Civil War Talk that you won't experience in a Zoom meeting. We have our share of everyday visitors who share stories and do research, and we also have a large community of historians, reenactors, and students, and I would even say fanatics of the American Civil War. Many of us don't just read a story or two about the American Civil War, we live and love to learn about the era. It's our passion. Civil War Talk had its origins way back in 1999, and today we've grown into a modern community of over 24,000 members and 117,000 different discussions about the war between the states. Membership in our community has always been free, and it's really easy to join too. If you want to avoid our pesky Google advertisements on our site, you can also get a first shot at registering for our future Zoom meetings and other great perks. You can support Civil War Talk with a premium membership for as little as $12 a year, and you'll support our community and get lots of great perks. If you aren't already a member, I want to invite you to join our community today. You'll find stories that you'll cherish, knowledge that will thrill, and they'll challenge and enlighten you. And you'll have friends that will last a lifetime. Join Civil War Talk tonight. We hope to see you all in our community soon.
Thanks, Mike. I hope everyone who's attending tonight will become a member of Civil War Talk tonight. And remember, it's always free. Mr. Norder, if you're ready, we'll get to those questions. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right, let's see if we can find the first one, which was way back at the beginning. I'm gonna have to scroll through them. Okay, could you repeat the names of the two cabinet officials that attended Hampton Roads with President Lincoln?
Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase and War Secretary Edwin M. Stanton.
Okay, that was John's question. Let's see. Tom would like to know, what exactly is a revenue? Is that a normal naval ship or?
The Treasury revenue ships, as the name says, were responsible for collecting import revenues. Eventually, through the decades, the revenue department, revenue ships morphed into the Coast Guard, is the easiest way to say it. It took a while, but it did happen. During the Civil War, most of the revenue ships were placed under command of the Navy. However, the Miami was a special ship that Chase had his revenue department buy and renovate. And he used it for dignitaries sailing up and down the Potomac, and for the president. The president took a couple more trips on the Miami to visit later in the war.
I see. So sort of like Air Force One.
Yes, you could think of it that way.
Michael Werner actually said, I believe a revenue ship would be viewed as a Coast Guard ship today. So somebody had actually added some commentary there. Let's see. Nate would like to know, was the Revenue Cutter Service responsible for customs enforcement prior
Yes.
to the Coast Guard?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Next question is not actually a question. It is a comment from Kenneth, and he said he served on the USS Goldsboro DDG-20 off the coast of Vietnam, and Goldsboro ended up as Chief of Naval Operations. That's interesting. How about that? And Gerald, who's here somewhere in the audience, said, you're doing a great, Steve, you're doing a great job. You might be interested that he's presented President Lincoln for 21 years, which is a great honor and blessing. And he's visited Fortress Monroe, Newport News, the Naval Museum, etc. And he's wearing his USS Abraham Lincoln hat tonight. Showing it to you right there. Let's see if we can spotlight.
Yes,
so everybody
that's
can.
good.
Can everybody see it? Put it back up there, Gerald. There it is.
Shall not perish.
Super.
Okay.
Thanks, Gerald. Okay, let's see. Let's get to the next question. Here's a question. Tina would like to know, was General Wool at 80 years old the oldest general in the forces who was still active in active?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. He started in the War of 1812. He volunteered for that war, fought over at Lundy Lane, and decided that he liked being in the Army better than what he was doing as a young man, which he was a clerk in the store, and he stayed in the Army. He did not finish out the Civil War though, because eventually he was moved from command at Fort Monroe up to New York City just before the draft riots, and he was not able to handle the draft riots. And so he was told to go back to his hometown, which was Troy, New York, and then to await orders, and he never received any more orders.
Wow, that's interesting.
He
So
died in just a few years after the war.
So they basically just kind of pushed him out, I guess.
Yes, they did.
So was it too far? This question was put up when you were talking about Camp Butler and how far it was to where the USS Virginia was. And someone would like to know, why did they not use artillery from there to shell the USS Virginia?
The CSS Virginia?
Oh, my bad.
Yeah, yes. During the Battle of Hampton Roads, in March 8, the first day of the Battle of Hampton Roads, the USS Congress and the USS Cumberland were just off the coast at Newport News and Camp Butler. And in fact, it was under command of General Mansfield. And during that battle, the artillery at Camp Butler, some of it was moved over to the beach and did fire on the Virginia. And it had as much effect as both the Cumberland and the Congress guns had on Virginia, which was nothing. And that was the closest that they could have done it.
Okay, let's see. The next is just a comment. It says very good turnout with 40. Somebody said 46, but I think we had 49 participants tonight. So congratulations on a very good turnout. Roy would like to know, during this whole operation, how much risk was there to President Lincoln personally?
The only risk would have been during the bombardment of Sewell's Point, and it's in my book. I didn't get into it in the talk, but during that bombardment, the president started at Fort Wool to watch the bombardment, but it wasn't close enough. So he got on a tug and sailed on the tug closer to where the bombardment was going on. And he got pretty close. And if there had been more Confederate artillery firing at the ships, he could have been, his tugboat could have been hit. There was not a risk when he landed and scouted the beach. There were no Confederates anywhere close to that.
Okay. What do you know the number and type of cannon that were at Sewell's Point in May of 1862? Someone asked.
I'm sorry, that I do not know. I think there was, I don't know the type, though probably there were some Columbiads and some Dahlgrens, because those cannon came from the Gosport Navy Yard. After the Confederates they captured a lot of cannon that was actually dispersed all over the Confederacy. And for some reason, the number 10 pops up into my head, but I wouldn't say for sure if that was the number.
Okay. The next question is there a comparison in the book of what's going on in other theaters of the war during this same period of time?
I do have a timeline and an introduction. Particularly the introduction, I do go through what was going on elsewhere, decide to set what was happening and what they were talking about on the ship as Miami as they were going down, just to give some background up to the point that the president actually sailed down to Fort Monroe.
Sure, thanks. Richard would like to know, was Lincoln or anyone with him not a little concerned that they might be in danger of being confronted by patrols by accident? They
did not say anything about that, and nothing happened. As I say, when he scouted that beach, there was evidence that there had been some Confederate cavalry pickets, but there were none around there. And there was, when Chase and General Wool first went there to look at that beach, they thought that there was some soldiers there, and it turned out to be 2 women and a couple children and a dog.
Well, that was lucky. A couple of people congratulated you on such a great presentation. And then the last question in the chat is from Roy. He said, how solid, or on the other hand, precarious, was the Confederate presence there at Norfolk and Portsmouth? Was this displacement already to happen anyway, or did Lincoln's presence and direct exert an influence that wouldn't have happened otherwise?
No, the Confederates were already evacuating Norfolk, Portsmouth, and the Navy Yard, and that was under orders of General Joe Johnston. The thinking was that once Yorktown had been abandoned, that Norfolk, according to Johnston, would automatically fall. So prior to Johnston pulling out on May 4, he had ordered the Confederate commander at Norfolk, General Huger, to organize his soldiers into brigades and send them to Richmond so they could join with Johnston's army. So Lincoln was came at the end, his push came at the end of that process of evacuation. And so if the Confederates had not evacuated, it would have been a whole different story, because they were pretty strongly entrenched. There's the land approach to Norfolk had a trench there with 30 cannon. And of course, the water approach, you had not only Sewell's Point and Craney Island forts, you had Fort Norfolk and a number of other batteries along the river, plus you had the Virginia. It would have been really hard to take that. And so some of the Confederate leaders did argue not to abandon Norfolk, but Johnston's idea prevailed.
I see. Well, that is all the questions we have in the log for tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. It was a great presentation. And before you guys sign off, just a reminder that all of our guests provide these presentations without compensation. And so we encourage everyone to please order a copy of Mr. Norder's book, Lincoln Takes Command, The Campaign to Seize Norfolk and the Destruction of the CSS Virginia. If you'd like to order that from Savas Beatty, the publisher, they are offering a special thank you for participating in this event tonight. And when you order Mr. Norder's book through the savasbeatty.com website, add the code at checkout to receive 20% off your total purchase. Tina's entering the code in the chat tonight for you to use when you purchase the book. Load the book in your cart, enter the code at checkout, and receive 20% off your entire purchase. So you can purchase multiple books and receive 20% off of the entire order. Thank you again, Mr. Norder, for being with us tonight. Be sure to join us next week. We'd love to have you back next week when we have Christopher Loperfido on December 9th. Christopher will be our guest on his book, Death, Disease, and Life at War, the Civil War Letters of Surgeon James D. Bennett, 111th and 98th New York Regiments. Christopher's also a member of Civil War Talk, and he's posted about his book there. I believe he had a book launch, didn't he, Mike?
Yeah, I think we did launch it. I'm not sure exactly when that was, but that was recently.
Yeah, it wasn't too long ago. It hasn't been out very long. So just a reminder, we have a great lineup coming for you, and I'm going to show them 3 at a time, so you have to wait. So next week we have, like I said, we have Christopher Loperfido. On December 16th, Bradley Gottfried with the maps of the cavalry in the Gettysburg campaign. Bradley doesn't do these things very often, and he's doing this one for us, and we're most appreciative. It's the atlas of the mounted operations from Brandy Station through Falling Waters, and so we're excited to welcome Bradley on December 16th. On December 30th, we'll actually have a follow-up presentation to this one, Mr. Norder. You'll have to join us that night. John Corstein will be here, and he will be talking about the sinking of the USS Monitor. And it'll actually be almost on the anniversary of that event when the Monitor, I think it was the 31st actually. So almost on the anniversary of the event. Not really a follow-up because this is about the Monitor, but still, you'd probably be interested in attending. On January 13th, we'll have Lance Hertigan back. And he was fantastic. If you were here last time, he talked about the Iron Brigade, and he'll be back on January 13th to tell some more stories of the Iron Brigade, and we're looking forward to having him. On January 20th, Matt Atkinson, who is a ranger at the Gettysburg National Military Park, will be with us, and his topic will be General Robert E. Lee. And on January 27th, we'll have Michael C. Hardy on North Carolina Remembers Gettysburg. And I believe we may have another one that we just scheduled today. Mike, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We just scheduled. We just published the book on. I guess did a book launch actually. Was it today or was it yesterday for First for the Union: Life and Death in the Civil War Army Corps from Antietam to Gettysburg. One of our members who's been around for a little while, Liberty and Union. He's actually the author of that book, and he's going to join us in February for our first February meeting.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that one too. So I hope that you guys enjoyed it tonight, and we will hope to see everyone back again on December 9th at 8:30 Eastern Standard, featuring Christopher E. Loperfido on his book, Death, Disease, and Life at War, the Civil War Letters of Surgeon James D. Benton, 111th and 98th New York Infantry. Hope to see you all then, and thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll look forward to seeing you on December 9th at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much.
That was an excellent presentation.